A mother is dead. Her body found brutally mutilated, her head severed, and police say the person responsible is none other than her own son. Alejandro David Gonzalez, once a son she loved unconditionally, now stands accused of one of the most chilling crimes you can imagine: stabbing and decapitating his mother, Teresa DeJesus Cruz Rubio. This is not just another case of a tragic loss. This is a crime so horrifying, it raises questions about the darkest side of human nature. And what makes it worse? The people closest to her, family, friends, never saw it coming. Alejandro was a man with a history, with mental health struggles that some believed might eventually push him to something unimaginable. But how does a mother's love become the thing that leads to her death? How does someone who was once loved turn into a killer? This story is one of betrayal, madness, and an unspeakable act that has left a family torn apart. Alejandro had just been released from prison and returned to live with Teresa, his mother. Little did she know, the very son she welcomed back would be the one to take her life. Stay with me as we walk through this horrific crime, step by step, uncovering the chilling details and the horrifying truth of what happened in that quiet home. What drove Alejandro to kill? Was it really mental illness or something far darker? Before we get into the details, I want to warn you, what you're about to hear is disturbing, and it will shake you to your core. This is the story of a family destroyed from within, by the very person who should have protected them. Teresa DeJesus Cruz Rubio was the kind of woman who lived for her family. Known for her selflessness, she was a mother whose life revolved around making sure her children felt loved, cared for, and safe. Those who knew her described her as warm, compassionate, and always willing to help. She found joy in the simplest of things: cooking a meal for her family, tending to her home, or sharing a quiet moment with those she loved. Teresa's devotion to her children was unwavering. She believed that her greatest role in life was being a mother, and she took it seriously. She gave all her energy to ensuring they were provided for, both emotionally and physically. There was no task too small, no sacrifice too great. Every decision she made centered on their well-being. Her home, always bustling with activity, was where her children found solace. It was where they were nurtured, where laughter filled the rooms, and where love was abundant. For Teresa, family wasn't just a word, it was everything. Her strength lay in her ability to keep her family together, even in times of hardship. But this love, this dedication to her children, would become the very thing that would bring her life to a tragic end. Teresa's relationship with her son, Alejandro David Gonzalez, was complex. As a young boy, Alejandro had been bright and full of promise, a son any mother would be proud of. But as he grew older, life became more difficult for him. He found himself struggling with mental health issues, and those struggles only deepened over the years. Teresa never stopped loving him though. She believed that no matter what, he was her son, and as a mother, it was her job to be there for him, even when it seemed impossible. Alejandro had a history of trouble with the law, spending time in and out of jail. Each time, Teresa welcomed him back home, hoping that this time would be different. Her belief in him never wavered. Despite the mistakes Alejandro made, she continued to show him love and support, always hoping for the best, always hoping he would turn his life around. But with every return home, things seemed to grow worse. Teresa's heart, though full of love for her son, began to feel the weight of the years. Alejandro's behavior had become more erratic, and the once vibrant young man she knew had become a stranger in his own home. As he grew older, his mental health continued to deteriorate, and he became more withdrawn, isolating himself from those who cared for him most. By the time Alejandro returned to live with Teresa after his release from prison, the strain on their relationship was becoming undeniable. Teresa, ever the optimist, welcomed him back, believing that maybe, just maybe, this time he could start anew. But something had shifted. The man who had once been her child, the boy who had once looked up to her, was now a man who barely spoke to her. It wasn't just his mental health struggles that had created a wall between them. It was also his anger, his confusion, and his inability to connect with the world around him. Teresa tried everything to reach him. She would check in on him, offer him support, try to bring him back into the family fold. But Alejandro remained distant, hiding behind his mental health challenges. The person she had loved so much seemed lost, unreachable. But Teresa, as any mother would, kept pushing forward. She told herself that this time would be different. She convinced herself that with time, things would improve. Despite the mounting signs that things were not okay, she clung to the hope that her son would eventually come back to her, emotionally at least. Yet, deep down, Teresa knew that something was not right. She could feel it in the air, the tension that hung over their home, the sense that things were getting worse rather than better. She felt it in Alejandro's mood swings, his outbursts, his refusal to open up. But as a mother, she couldn't abandon him. She could never turn her back on her own son, no matter how much he pushed her away. Life in the house was not only strained emotionally but also financially. Alejandro's inability to hold down steady work and his increasing dependence on his mother had begun to take a toll. Teresa, who had always managed to keep things together, found herself struggling, not just to provide for her son but to manage the weight of a household that was crumbling under the pressure of mental illness, financial strain, and emotional exhaustion. Her friends and family noticed the changes. Teresa, who had always been the strong one, the one who could weather any storm, now looked worn down. She had always kept a smile on her face even when things were tough, but recently her smile had faded. Her energy had drained. She was always tired, always overwhelmed. And despite everything, she continued to put on a brave face, continuing to care for Alejandro, continuing to support him, even as it was clear that she was running on empty. But there was no way out. Teresa didn't know how to stop. She couldn't stop being the mother who believed in her son, who thought that one day he would get better. Even when her own health started to deteriorate, even when the toll of years of caring for Alejandro had worn her down, she never stopped hoping that something would change. Life in the house remained on its regular course, even though it was anything but normal. Teresa continued with her daily routine, getting up early, preparing breakfast, doing the little things that kept her home running smoothly. Alejandro, however, had become even more reclusive. His interactions with her were minimal, and when they did talk, it was usually brief and strained. His mental health issues had become so severe that he could barely communicate without anger or aggression, and any attempt at conversation ended in silence or frustration. It wasn't unusual for Teresa to check on him, offering him his meals, trying to talk to him, but every day the emotional wall between them grew higher. Teresa's optimism had started to fade, and she began to realize that the situation was not just bad, it was dangerous. Her hope for a change was starting to wane, and the truth was sinking in. Things weren't going to get better. Teresa couldn't give up. She kept trying even though the signs were everywhere that something terrible was on the horizon. Alejandro David Gonzalez was no stranger to mental health struggles. His history of mental illness was well documented, something his family, friends, and even the community had come to know. His recent release from prison raised alarm bells among his relatives, who feared the worst. How would Alejandro reintegrate into his mother Teresa's home after spending years behind bars? Would the same behaviors, the same struggles, resurface once he was back? In the weeks leading up to the crime, Alejandro began to retreat into himself more and more. He spent long stretches of time alone in his room, avoiding interaction with his mother. When Teresa tried to engage him, asking how he was doing or offering help with something as simple as dinner, the responses were cold, distant, or non-committal. There were small arguments, minor confrontations, nothing to suggest the level of violence Alejandro was capable of, but the tension in the house was palpable. The silence between them became deafening, and the distance between mother and son only seemed to grow. Despite the tension, Teresa continued with her routines. She prepared meals, checked on Alejandro, tried to encourage him to step out of his isolation. But every time she was met with resistance or indifference. She had always been a patient and loving mother, but even she couldn't ignore the unsettling silence that filled the house. But as much as Teresa tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, the truth was hard to ignore. Alejandro was not the same son she had raised. His moods were erratic, and his behavior increasingly unpredictable. There were whispers among family members about his state of mind, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. The day Teresa's life came to a brutal end seemed like any other. She followed her normal routine, waking early, preparing breakfast, caring for her home, and trying to keep things together. She spent the morning tending to her plants, perhaps hoping the familiarity of her daily tasks would help her feel grounded amid the unease. Alejandro, however, remained mostly silent, locked away in his room. At some point that morning, Alejandro emerged, and without warning, the atmosphere in the house shifted. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a sudden, violent attack. Teresa was taken completely off guard. Alejandro had grabbed a blade, an assault weapon he would use with terrifying precision. The violence wasn't random, it wasn't a moment of fury, it was deliberate. He attacked Teresa directly, first stabbing her, then escalating the violence to a level that would forever be etched in her family's memory. What happened in the moments following the first strike is unclear, but the brutality of the act is undeniable. Teresa would have fought for her life, but she had no chance. Alejandro was intent on carrying out his attack with chilling focus, and before long, it reached its devastating conclusion. Teresa was beheaded. There was no doubt about the intent. It was merciless, calculated, and violent. The scene was not one of self-defense or accident. It was an execution of pure brutality. Alejandro had taken control of the situation, and there was no room for survival. Neighbors later reported hearing odd noises, like yelling or sounds of movement, but no one had intervened in time. Alejandro remained inside the house after the crime, leaving his mother's body as a silent testament to the violence he had just committed. He didn't run, didn't flee, didn't confess, he simply stayed. The house that had once been full of warmth now stood as a grim reminder of a son's betrayal. In the hours after the crime, Alejandro's behavior was detached, almost eerily calm. There was no panic, no sign of remorse. When Teresa's body was discovered, the sheer brutality of the attack became evident. The police found Teresa's lifeless body, but there was something else they noticed. Alejandro was still in the house, acting like nothing had changed. His actions weren't those of a man in a panic, nor were they those of someone who had just committed a violent crime. Instead, he remained oddly composed, his responses detached from the reality of the situation. When the police arrived, they were faced with an unsettling scene. The body of Teresa had been left undisturbed, her brutalized form a silent testament to the crime. There were no signs of a struggle that suggested Teresa had tried to defend herself, indicating once again that the attack had been quick and definitive. The beheading was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was premeditated. The calculated nature of the crime left little doubt in the minds of investigators about Alejandro's role in his mother's death. As police began their investigation, the family was left grappling with the reality of what had occurred. How could a son, someone they had known and loved, be capable of such an act? Alejandro's mental health history came under intense scrutiny, and his actions in the days leading up to the crime painted a chilling picture. Alejandro had been living with his mother, but there were signs of his increasing instability that had gone unnoticed by most. Those closest to him tried to make sense of the tragedy, but the answers weren't easy to find. The arrest of Alejandro David Gonzalez came swiftly, but it wasn't without its share of questions. Police had gathered enough evidence to charge him with the brutal murder of his mother, Teresa DeJesus Cruz Rubio. It was a crime so shocking, so brutal, that the entire community was left in disbelief. How could a son do this to the woman who had given him everything? The woman who had cared for him, believed in him, and never gave up on him, even after all the trouble he'd caused? By the time of his arrest, the investigation had already painted a damning picture of Alejandro. The brutal beheading of his mother in their shared home, an act of such violence and finality, left little room for doubt. The police had found traces of blood in unexpected places, signs of a struggle, and the lack of any defensive wounds on Teresa's body suggested she had been caught completely off guard. But what truly sealed his fate were the chilling details uncovered by investigators. Text messages between Alejandro and his mother in the days leading up to her death revealed a growing tension, with Alejandro's behavior becoming more erratic. Police also found disturbing evidence at the scene, clothing with traces of Teresa's blood, and an unusual amount of time that Alejandro spent away from the scene after the murder. He didn't show any sign of remorse. He didn't run. He didn't flee. Alejandro stayed, even as his mother's body lay lifeless in the home they once shared. As the arrest unfolded, the shockwave of the crime rippled through the community. Those who had known Teresa, who had worked with her, and those who had seen Alejandro grow up, none of them could comprehend how this had happened. To many it seemed impossible. How could this family, once so tight-knit, fall apart in such a devastating way? The police didn't have all the answers yet, but they had enough to know that Alejandro was the key to solving this horrific crime. As the case moved to trial, the courtroom became the stage for an intense legal battle. Alejandro's defense team painted him as a victim, a man who had been struggling with mental illness for years, a man who had lost control in the heat of the moment. They argued that the crime was not premeditated, that it was the result of Alejandro's deteriorating mental state, exacerbated by years of untreated psychological issues. His attorneys called on experts to testify about his history of mental health struggles, painting a picture of a man who had been broken by his circumstances, a man who had no intention of committing such a violent act. But the prosecution was not so easily swayed. They countered with a different narrative. They argued that this was no act of rage, no spontaneous moment of madness. The prosecution didn't stop there. They also introduced text messages sent between Alejandro and his mother in the days before her death. In these messages, Teresa expressed concern over his behavior and even noted how disconnected he had become. Yet Alejandro's responses were cold, dismissive, and often unsettling. But what struck the hardest were his actions after the crime. Despite his mother's violent death, Alejandro did not act in a way that most would expect from someone who had just murdered their parent. There was no remorse, no panic, just a calm, detached presence. The prosecutor's argument was simple. Alejandro had killed his mother with chilling intention and method, and now he was attempting to manipulate the court into believing otherwise. As the trial unfolded, more unexpected revelations came to light, each adding more weight to the case against Alejandro. One of the most chilling moments came when witnesses spoke about the state of the house in the weeks leading up to the murder. Teresa's friends described how she had seemed increasingly exhausted, even fearful. She had tried time and time again to support Alejandro, but it was clear to those around her that his behavior had become more and more erratic. It was also revealed that Teresa had spoken to close friends about her growing concerns for her safety, though she never fully believed that her son would act on his threats. One particularly striking piece of evidence was Alejandro's behavior in the days following the crime. He had acted nonchalant when questioned, as though the murder was just another event in the course of his life. This coldness, combined with the forensic evidence and his lack of remorse, painted a clear picture for the prosecution. This was no crime of passion. Alejandro had planned and carried out his mother's murder with cold, calculated precision. Another twist came when a family member, in an emotional testimony, revealed that Teresa had been attempting to distance herself from Alejandro in the months leading up to her death. Despite the love she had for him, she had confided in a family member that she felt unsafe around him. Her growing fear was clear, and it was a tragic irony that she had tried to protect herself from someone who had been in her life for so long. As the trial neared its conclusion, all eyes were on the jury. They had been presented with an overwhelming amount of evidence. Forensic reports, witness testimonies, and the chilling behavior of Alejandro before, during, and after the murder. The question wasn't so much whether Alejandro had killed his mother, it was about the why. Could a man with a documented mental illness be held fully responsible for such an act? Or was he truly incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions? After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Alejandro David Gonzalez was found guilty of first-degree murder. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. The jury concluded that Alejandro had intentionally taken his mother's life, that the brutal nature of the crime and the lack of any signs of remorse left no doubt about his intent. His mental illness, while a factor, did not excuse the severity of his actions. Teresa's family members were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, trying to come to terms with the betrayal. The pain of losing a loved one is always devastating, but this was different. It wasn't just the loss of a mother, it was the loss of everything that Teresa had worked so hard to build. Her love, her care, her belief in Alejandro, it had all been thrown away in one violent act. How could they move forward knowing that it was her own son who ended her life in such a brutal and calculated way? The emotional toll was immense. Teresa's siblings, her children, and those who were closest to her struggled to understand how they could have missed the signs. What had they overlooked? Was there something they should have noticed? And then there was the guilt. Many wondered if they could have done more to protect Teresa, to help Alejandro before it was too late. News of Teresa's death and Alejandro's involvement shocked the community. The man who had once been seen as a friendly neighbor, someone many had trusted, had now become the face of a crime so horrific it was almost impossible to grasp. Alejandro had been well known in the town, a man who once seemed capable of turning his life around, but who, in the end, shattered the very family he should have protected. People who had seen him grow up could barely reconcile the image of the friendly young man with the cold, calculated murderer who took his mother's life. Alejandro's actions raised questions about the nature of evil itself. How could someone so close, someone who had been loved, commit such an unspeakable act? His betrayal was not just of his mother, it was a betrayal of everything that had ever been built on trust, love, and family. The community, which had once welcomed him back after his release from prison, was now left grappling with disbelief and horror. His name would forever be associated with the crime he committed, and the questions surrounding his motives continued to echo through the halls of the local courthouse and beyond. Teresa's family was left to mourn not only the loss of their mother, but the loss of the family unit itself, torn apart by the very person who should have kept it together. Mental illness had been a significant factor in Alejandro's life, but did that explain the brutality of his actions? Some argued that his mental state played a role in his decision-making, that the guilt and anger that had been building inside him erupted in the most horrifying way. But others pointed to the cold, methodical nature of the crime, How could someone who was so mentally unwell commit an act so precise, so deliberate? There were moments throughout the investigation that raised questions. How had Alejandro managed to keep his emotions so well hidden in the weeks leading up to the crime? How had he remained calm in the face of his mother's growing distress? Could his indifference to her suffering have been a sign that he was planning something much darker than anyone knew? Some close to the family believed that Alejandro's history of mental illness didn't excuse the murder. They argued that he had known exactly what he was doing when he took his mother's life. The lack of defensive wounds on Teresa, the brutality of the beheading, these were not the actions of someone simply lashing out in a moment of rage. The entire crime had been premeditated, and the coldness with which it was carried out suggested something far more calculated. The trial concluded and Alejandro was sentenced. Teresa's family began the long, painful process of mourning. For them, there was no justice that could bring Teresa back. The pain of knowing that her son had been the one to take her life was a wound that would never fully heal. Each family member grappled with their own guilt, their own what-ifs. Could they have seen the signs? Could they have done more to help Alejandro before things escalated this far? Teresa's children, especially her youngest, struggled to reconcile the image of the loving mother they had known with the reality of her death. Her siblings spoke about the vibrant, kind-hearted woman she had been, and how the tragedy had taken away more than just their family member. It had taken away the foundation of their lives. They were left to pick up the pieces, trying to move on while haunted by the unrelenting question: how could it have come to this? Today on Bruised Voice, what do you think truly happened? Do you believe Alejandro's mental illness was to blame, or was it something darker at play? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have an open conversation about this tragic story. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the chilling true crime stories we cover. Stay tuned for more, and thank you for being a part of the Bruised Voice community.